You wrote a book on a boy band? Are you fangirling? Honestly, I'll admit it. They're good looking. But just that wouldn't have been enough for a reason for me to write a whole book. Hello, my name is Lee Ji Yang. I am the author of the book BTS Art Revolution. After I published this book last spring, I had various opportunities to appear in interviews and on TV shows. But every time I went to those places, there was one common question that people always asked me. Every time I am asked of that question, I think what they were really feeling inside could be expressed like this. Judging by the looks, you don't seem that young, to be honest. Why would a professor who teaches philosophy write a book about a boy band? Are you fangirling? I'll just be honest with you. They're good looking. They're handsome, cool, dance, and sing great. We all know that by now. But just that wouldn't have been enough for a reason for me to write a whole book. Rather, I was surprised when I paid attention to what they were actually saying. So I selected a few of their albums that have been released so far, organized by theme. When BTS first debuted in 2013, they began to talk about the frustrations and criticisms that teenagers of their generation felt towards school, adults, the older generation, and society. However, after their debut period, as they moved into the next phase, when boys begin to grow into young men, the content of their criticism gradually started to change. As BTS became young adults, their dissatisfaction with society and their sharp criticisms continued. In fact, we live in a competitive society, and it's not as if we're asking for all outcomes to be distributed equally. But in competitions, at the very least, we believe that the conditions should be fair. However, in a society where even the starting conditions are different and where endless competition is treated as an absolute good, BTS raises a question. They ask, is this justice? This is one of the songs that really pulled me deep into becoming a fan. The song talks about the pain and oppression that people experience under this global neoliberal system and how, as a result, everyone suffers. Children suffer in their own way and adults suffer in theirs. Then how is this manifested? In reality, it inevitably appears as some kind of mental illness. So, regarding people who suffer from these mental illnesses, the song directly addresses experiences like depression, obsession, anxiety, and even suicide attempts. And by sharing these stories firsthand, it offered words of comfort to the listeners, saying, we feel the same way too. In fact, as far as I know, there aren't that many major K pop singers who talk about things like depression or mental health issues publicly. But when these boys did, people realized, oh, so I'm not the only one going through this. Just that alone became a source of comfort for many people. But they're taking it a step further. This is the part that really caught my attention: critique, comfort, and empathy, and then alternatives. So, what kind of alternatives? They're not grand, but basically say you don't have to live exactly the way society tells you to. Don't try so hard. You don't have to win all the time. It's okay to lose. One of the phrases that struck me the most was, it's okay to lose. And it's okay to stop too. You don't have to just run like crazy in this endless competition. That's the kind of alternative the song was offering. And going even further, it asked, for a better world, what kind of us should we become? If people like us, like little sparrows struggling with short legs, if we come together and stand in solidarity, then even this daunting world can start to change little by little. And that as long as we are together, we will never truly lose. That is the message the song was delivering. Although they were much younger than me, I truly felt a sense of respect. I really did come to respect them. And in this context, they were basically telling, face yourself and speak up for yourself. And only by that, the true meaning of the message, love yourself, can be achieved. Telling people to speak up with their own voice. So the message of BTS feels like reading an entire book. If each of the album is like a book, then BTS's stories so far have continued moving forward, one volume after another, unfolding like an epic, ongoing, ever expanding novel. As the group grew older and continued to develop musically and artistically, they themselves have also been growing and evolving as individuals, both personally and professionally. The official fandom of the group, the armies, have also been growing together too. In fact, even older fans like me are growing along with them. Let's create a better world. Within this group of BTS and the army, within this community, this is the most important value. So, what can we do to achieve it? Since the group delivered this message, the fans would every day think about what they can actually do to put it into practice. If one were to call this a kind of grace or blessing from the artists, though that might sound a bit strong, how can they return that love to the world? So, almost every day, armies are constantly donating and engaging in charity work, seeking out people in marginalized areas and those who can't afford medical expenses for surgery. Those charity works are not occasional or just a one time thing. Instead, they try to systematize it as part of their lives and make continuous efforts to keep it going. So far, you might think that they're doing an excellent job of delivering their message and that the fans are also responding to that message in a truly admirable way. However, until recently, say before last year, people didn't really know much about BTS. So people would say, but why aren't those guys so famous? So then the fans started to dig into the reasons behind that. As for that, they pointed out that BTS belonged to a very small company without capital or media power, so they couldn't get proper exposure within the broadcasting system. And when it comes to the US, although they're now huge, it wasn't like that from the beginning. In the US, this is probably how most people saw it. Korea? Isn't that the divided country in Asia that makes Samsung phones? So they were a boy band from such a country that doesn't even sing in English. There also exist some prejudices against boy bands. Boy bands? Such prejudices that don't take them seriously. So when the BTS fans asked radio stations to play their songs, how do you think they replied? Absolutely not. To requests for BTS, the usual responses were ask for some real music. Who would listen to this stuff? Who even understands Korean? Why would you ask us to play songs like this? So, the fans and the group had to endure countless instances of such disregard and oppression. But the fans never gave in to that. No matter what kind of disregard or prejudice came their way, they stood their ground. Because the fans felt their music was outstanding and had the power to change people, the fans took it as a kind of a mission to spread it widely. So they tirelessly kept requesting songs on the radio. And then there are those record stores in malls where sales are counted for the Billboard charts. The fans would stop by those every day. Even after work, they would go and ask the stores to stock BTS albums. Please bring them in. Why are BTS albums still not available? So the fans were going around doing that all over the United States. Eventually, the Recording Industry Association of Korea got a contact from the US part of music. So this contact was actually the first historical moment where an official export request for a BTS album was made. The process was quite astonishing, to be honest. I analyzed this in detail in my book as well. And this process was not just about a label being connected to the media, having money, and arranging for appearances on TV or radio. Without any of that power, it was truly an ordinary group of people with nothing special about them, coming together in solidarity to create a grassroots cultural movement. And through this, the armies came to a realization. When the American and Western fans looked into the reason BTS did not get much recognition when their songs were so great, they came to a conclusion for it to be racism or even xenophobia. They realized that it stemmed from the kind of prejudice and mindset rooted in an overwhelming sense of superiority that believes English is the only language. It was a process where they became aware that in order for BTS to be properly recognized and acknowledged as musicians, they had to break through and confront those prejudices. So, even in reality, even if someone is, for example, a white American male, someone who would typically be considered at the very top, if you were to divide society into hierarchies, even a white male at the very top of that chain, when he becomes a fan of BTS, he undergoes a certain transformation. He gets to internalize the prejudice and oppression that BTS sings of, as if he himself were a minority experiencing it. That was an incredibly surprising point for me. And then there's something I call army work. Army is their fandom, right? You might wonder, what kind of work does a fan do? But there exists something called army work, and it is actually a thing. I think this is probably the same for all fans of somebody. It's basically doing online polls and streaming their music. I myself stream their music 24 hours during their comeback season. But when it comes to army, one more important and rather particular task is added to that, a basic duty, and that is media monitoring. Sometimes articles are published after fair and proper research, but as you all know, there are also a lot of articles that are not like that. So when Army sees those kinds of articles, what do? They fight back in the comments sometimes, of course, but just clicking gives the sites money, right? Since traffic brings them revenue, they take screenshots instead. And then they share those screenshots within the community. So this is their own unique way of retaliating those media. And if things really get out of hand, they would make phones ring off hooks. What I found really interesting in this process is that one of the things we learn in school is what we call media literacy. It's about how to critically understand and read what the media is saying and how people learn automatically from the media. While carrying out these basic army works, fans naturally come to understand, almost physically, how the media fabricates or distorts facts, creates certain frames, and subtly tells stories from sides. Let me give you an example. It was late last fall. Something quite big happened, at least for BTS fans. A t shirt worn by one of the BTS members became an international issue. As that t shirt became an issue, the appearance on the Japanese TV was suddenly cancelled. And although he wasn't even wearing it somewhere official, they made a problem out of that member. But as you all might well know, the origin of that incident was right after the Supreme Court ruling on compensation for forced labor, which became the starting point for the trade retaliation from Japan that we are experiencing now. Then some Japanese media simply echoed that rhetoric of Japan's extreme far right groups. I think that was expectable. But the most devastating thing was that so many Korean media outlets simply adopted the tone of those Japanese media. Armies were outraged. Some newspaper offices had their phone lines ringing off the hook. But what made things even worse was that major Western media outlets also started to echo that same narrative. The situation was really escalating, and it was honestly very distressing. Everyone was in tears, fighting. And Western fans didn't know how to understand the incident since they weren't familiar with the history between Japan and Korea. So the army strove for a way to show the truth of the matter. Then they managed to discover some materials for explanation. And they came to realize that while Japan had been creating narratives favorable to itself since World War II, Korea had hardly produced any such materials in English. So, what did the fans do when they came together? They explained the historical and political background of the incident, reviewed all the false reports and incorrect news articles that had come out, and gathered every piece of material that could help people understand the context. With all of this, they published a white paper project report about the length of a booklet. And to the world, they distributed it online for free. Of course, it was also distributed for free in Korean, English, and even Japanese. At the same time, donations were also being made to organizations for the victims of Japanese military sexual slavery and to organizations for atomic bomb victims. Many of the armies say that they met BTS at the most difficult moments in their lives and were able to find some comfort through them. But this comfort was not just a temporary relief. It made people face who they truly are, gave them the strength to live on, and showed them the hope that if they face this tough and miserable world together, they can change it. So, whenever I appear on TV shows and such, they often tend to ask me questions like this: what does BTS mean to Professor Lee? And such questions. You know what I mean, right? After taking some moment to think it through, the answer I came up with was this. To me, BTS is the presence that allowed me to live in this world with hope once again. So to me, they are hope. Frankly speaking, I am not much of a happy or optimistic type of person. There isn't anyone like that among the people around me who majored in philosophy. It is also a characteristic of the field. So I tended to be pessimistic and cynical, and usually thought, will it be any different if I tried? That kind of side of me was dominant, and most of my experiences in life were like that. But it was BTS and Army who gave me hope that maybe if people work together, we could make this world a little better. And that's why I became an Army. Now, I've only shared a tiny bit so far. This is just a drop in the bucket. But don't you feel some of your prejudices about Army and BTS fading away? You might have used to think, what's so great about a boy band? Or, meh, those bunch of fangirls. Am I right? I used to think that way too. But I got to even learn from them. If there's just one thing we should let go of as we go through life, what would it be? I learned that it's probably prejudice. Where does prejudice come from? I think it comes from ignorance. Such prejudice may have not existed if people listened to their music, watched their contents properly, and knew what armies do. It comes from not knowing. But even without knowing, people try to justify themselves. So, prejudice that stems from ignorance leads to discrimination, and this discrimination turns into violent oppression against others. But this oppression isn't just directed at others, it also comes back as a boomerang. In the end, within oneself, it becomes a shackle within a narrow frame that restrains oneself from growing any further. So, there's one thing that I'd like to ask you. First, open your hearts and your eyes. I hope that you all take some time to ask yourselves this question. What have I failed to truly see because I was trapped in the shackles of my own prejudice until now? I truly believe that this is an important and significant first step for us to grow, to develop, and to make this world a much better place for everyone. Thank you.